I'm sitting here at the conference hotel of the Recommender Systems Conference 2022 in Seattle, and I'm here with Max Harper. Max Harper is one of the three organizers of the RecSys conference. Max found a little bit of time just before the conference starts to talk with me and talk about his career and about some advice maybe for PhD students or prospective PhD students who consider a career in recommender systems and doing a PhD in general. Max is an applied scientist at Amazon here in Seattle. He's at the RecSys steering committee. He started his career in recommender systems in 2003 when he began his PhD at the University of Minnesota under the supervision of Joseph Konstan. And he has a very interesting career. He did a business startup. He worked as a software engineer. He worked many years as a postdoc or research scientist at the University of Minnesota in the Group Lens project. And I'm very glad to talk to him today. Max, how are you doing? Could you sleep the recent nights, or were you just very, very busy the recent days just before the conference starts?
Definitely very busy. There's just a constant stream of low-level decisions that need to be made. And the frequency with which those decisions need to be made increases as you get closer to the conference. So a little bit less maybe Friday and today, but it's been just up. Mm-hmm. So, but I'm sleeping okay. The things that kept me up at night are mostly resolved, I hope. So people registered for the conference, that was a big worry. I mean,
how many people are registered now?
Well,
for on-site.
Oh, for on-site it is 760.
Wow, that's very good, right?
It's very good. It will be the second biggest in-person ever.
Wow.
So it's not as big as Denmark.
Yeah.
But it is now bigger than Vancouver, which is the year before that. And then 1,200 some people total, which is the biggest
great.
ever.
Every year it's growing, I think, in total. And
it is, yeah. So that's good. That was a huge worry because you have to commit to a hotel space like this years in advance.
Yeah.
And you make these massive financial commitments, and then you're like, well, is anyone going to come? No idea.
Yeah.
So there are a number of sort of bigger picture things that were big worries, and those got resolved. Probably the last big one was the aquarium event, and that got resolved a few weeks ago. So since then, it's mostly been just smaller things. So hopefully we're good to go. We'll see.
I was wondering, you changed to Amazon in 2019, right? And probably that was about the same time you applied to organize this conference, or when?
It was right around then, yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So it was right before COVID hit. And I will say that COVID doubled the amount of work for organizing this conference, at least.
Yeah.
So, I mean, even if there weren't all the uncertainties and contingency plans, there's having to plan a virtual aspect alongside the physical aspect is just a massive undertaking. And we're asking a lot more of the authors too, because we're asking them to pre-record videos and make posters that are digital and all that stuff. But, given all that extra work, I think it's a really nice thing for the attendees because now we have this nice online resource that we can look at through the rest of the year. So you can go back and revisit, papers, posters, talks, all that sort of stuff very easily.
My first question was, how does it come that Joe Konstan was your PhD supervisor?
Just luck.
Just luck.
Blind luck, yeah. So I had kind of an untraditional path to getting a PhD in computer science. I did not major in computer science in college. But I sort of realized when I graduated that my favorite courses that I'd taken were CS courses. And so I decided to become a software engineer and worked as a software engineer for 5 years, and eventually decided that I wanted to be a teacher.
Okay.
And there was a mentor who was at a small teaching college, Macalester College, and he said, yeah, you could get into a PhD program. And I was like, really? I could? So I applied. We were living in Denver, Colorado at the time. I applied to a bunch of places, and ended up picking the University of Minnesota, which I grew up in Minnesota, and so there were lots of good parts of that for us. But I went into the CS program not knowing anything about really what I wanted to do. And
like the master's in computer science or the PhD?
I was admitted to a PhD program. Yeah.
Okay.
And I sort of initially thought that I was kind of targeted at a distributed systems kind of path, but I quickly realized that wasn't going to work well for me. And so I reached out to Professor Konstan and said, hey, I'd really like to try working with you in your lab. And he was very gracious and offered me some research to do unfunded for a while. And and so I started working in the Group Lens lab and loved it there. So that was easy once I'd found my way to the lab.
I assume that at that time, Joe Konstan wasn't, I mean, nowadays he's like super popular and famous, at least in the recommender systems community. So I guess at that time, was he more like a normal professor or was he already, I don't know?
He was tenured at the time. So and I think, he was already pretty well known. So this was like 2003 or so.
Yeah.
And certainly there was no recommender systems conference yet. Yeah. But he and John Riedel, his close colleague, had published a set of really influential papers up to that point. And so, in fact, I think some of Joe's most cited papers are from that period of kind of the mid to late 90s and early 2000s. A lot of the foundational work on, what a recommender system is, like what is this problem even,
yes.
Recommending Usenet news, but then what are the applications in e-commerce and so forth. And Joe and John founded a company in the late 90s too, called Net Perceptions. I don't know if you've heard that story.
What's the name?
It's called Net Perceptions.
Okay, no.
And it was they took some time away from the university and founded that company. It was just a recommender systems company. And it grew quite large. It grew to 300 people or something like that.
Wow.
And but failed to get Amazon as a client. And I don't know the story very well because this was, for me, it was ancient history by the time I joined the PhD program. But they actually left sort of before the decline. And so that was good timing for them. They went back to the university because they were both passionate about teaching. And they kind of had made their impact, and the company was growing and so forth. The company didn't last much longer.
Okay.
But they turned back and came back to recommender systems and founded the Movie Lens system. That was in the late 90s, where the Each Movie researchers from IBM they were told they couldn't maintain that system anymore. And Joe and John reached out and said, hey, we'll take that. And that all laid the foundation for a lot of what I did when I was a grad student and then later a research scientist at Minnesota.
I'm not so familiar with the American way of doing a PhD. I think it took you 6 years to do a PhD, right? 5 or 6 years?
That's true.
Is that a normal duration for a PhD, or fast or slow?
It depends. So that's master's and PhD together. You can break it up however you want. It might have been, 2.5 years for the master's and then the rest for the PhD. Yeah, at the time at our university, 6 years was the median. And they saw that as a problem, but that's where I was at that time. There were students who took 7, 8, 9 years.
It's the same in Germany nowadays. After your PhD, you founded a startup as well. Did you do some side projects during the PhD already? Or internships or research visits?
Yeah, it's funny because I was really kind of targeting an academic position for most of my PhD. And then I started teaching and kind of realized that might not be the right thing for me in the long run. And
the teaching or the
teaching.
Okay.
Yeah, I enjoyed TAing, but then I taught kind of the operating systems class for senior level undergraduates at the U. The U is short for the University of Minnesota. And it was a large class, over 100 people, and it didn't make me very happy. I thought I did a good job with it, but I was very stressed out about it all the time, and I realized that the things that were bringing me joy in life were really more along the lines of, sitting down and focusing on code for a few hours at a time. And the performance aspect of teaching was harder on me, I think, and I was hard on myself. I ultimately decided that that wasn't the right thing. And so kind of late in my PhD, I did a little bit of a shift towards thinking towards industry. I did one internship at Nokia Research, which was an interesting time to be there because the iPhone launched the same summer that I was there. At the time, Nokia was all excited about their super powerful smartphone, but it was obvious from 10 seconds in that the iPhone was a game changer and that Nokia had no hope. But that was a wonderful internship. I got to work with Joe McCarthy, my mentor, and the other intern I worked with ended up founding a Y Combinator company, and he went the startup path, and he's still running that company today. Got maybe a little bit of an idea that was a possibility. Yeah, and so when I graduated, I really wanted to stay in Minneapolis. There just weren't a lot of jobs for me there outside of teaching, and so I just decided to try starting a company. And it turns out I wasn't very good at that at all.
Okay.
But I got some NSF funding for it. There's actually NSF, National Science Foundation in the United States, has a grant program for small businesses. And my co-founder and I went through that process and at least funded the company and kind of took a shot at it, but ultimately it wasn't making enough money to keep it going for too long.
Okay.
So we started taking consulting projects, and then that's the end. Because once you stop committing 100% of your effort to it, you have no chance.
Yeah, and then you decided to go back to academia, right? You took on then a research position again. I worked for a year as a software engineer at a local company and at Code 42, right? Like Crash Plan. I used the software for a while.
Oh, cool. Yeah. I helped build Crash Plan, and that was really fun. But Joe and John gave me a call and asked if I wanted to be a research scientist in the group, and I decided that would be a great thing to do, and I'm happy that I did it. So I spent 7 years there and kind of dived into a different area than I did during my PhD. In my PhD, I was much more focused on online communities and more HCI research. And during my time as a research scientist, I focused more on building Movulons back up as a research system and conducting user-centric recommender systems research, which was a good move, I think. There were lots of PhD students and undergraduates and master's students who jumped on board and ran experiments on Movulons, and it was a productive time for us, and it was fun.
Can you explain more how a PhD works in the US, or at least in your case, how it worked? Like, how did you get funding, and what were your tasks? Like, did you only do research, or did you do... You did some teaching, you mentioned that already. Did you do administration, I don't know, organizing workshops already, or...
Right. May be different from university to university. In our university, there were kind of three main sources of funding for students. Two of them were through the university. One of them was external. So that one was grants, basically, National Science Foundation or Facebook or Google or whatever. I was funded either as a research assistant or as a teaching assistant. So initially, I was always a teaching assistant, so I did a lot of that. And so what that meant was I had one class each semester that I, sometimes in a group, but usually I was the only TA. And so I would do various things. I would grade, I would lecture, I would work with groups, I would do administration tasks just to make the course easier to run for the professor. And then the other source of funding is a research assistantship. And that was dependent on professors having research funds, which in our group, PhD students did contribute to that, typically later on in years 4 or 5 and plus. Our group typically targeted the National Science Foundation. That was our preferred place to get money from, though we had other sources of money as well. And then, we would write research grants, and if they got funded, then that was a way for us to be paid to be graduate students.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the basic idea there. And most PhD programs in the United States try not to have unfunded PhD students. I think there are probably some programs that do, but I know at Minnesota, every student was supposed to have funding throughout. And it was the master's students who had a really hard time getting funding. So they would fight over the teaching assistantships.
Okay. And I saw that you published quite a good amount of papers during your PhD time. I counted 17, which I guess is quite a high amount for a PhD student.
That sounds high, but yeah, okay.
Did you do most of the work for the papers on your own, or did you supervise, like when you were a PhD student, did you supervise master students? Or did you collaborate a lot?
Yeah, well, it depended on the papers, right? So our group was very collaborative. Yeah, so typically we tried to have one student clearly as the leader of the research effort. So the first author wasn't so much in debate most of the time. And then the last author was typically that student's advisor, but not always. And then all the middle authors went to meetings together and pitched in where they could, and that was a mix. We had a research scientist at the time. We had undergraduates and master's students. There were other PhD students and other professors. Mm-hmm. And so it was a wonderful experience for me because it was such a collaborative environment. Everyone was very supportive of one another and not competitive at all, and I really appreciated that. I was also lucky because when I was new in the program, Joe, John, and Lauren Terveen, who was at the time the third member of the Group Lens faculty, had just secured a very large grant from the National Science Foundation, along with researchers from the University of Michigan School of Information and Carnegie Mellon, HCII. So the three universities, it was a group of 7 professors across those universities. So I got to work with social psychologists from Carnegie Mellon and economists from Michigan. And that was just a wonderful way to kind of get cross-disciplinary insights, to learn, to just explore different ideas. And so I felt very outside the mainstream. We were in a computer science department. And so the kinds of questions we were asking were fairly unusual when I met with other graduate students around the department. But it was a really collaborative and fun time.
That sounds really good. What did you like most of your PhD time?
The latter half, I would say. Once I was done with my coursework, and once I was done TAing, then it felt like I had all this time to just focus on research questions and getting stuff done that we as a group thought were important questions to answer. And so, years 4, 5, and 6 were really, really nice. I mean, that was a wonderful time for sure. Years 1, 2, and 3 were very hard, and I worked really hard and was stressed out quite a bit from time to time. So that was less enjoyable, but also an important thing to do, I think.
Did many other PhD students quit? Did you have PhD students in your group who quit?
Yeah, that does happen, for sure. And, it's not... Yes, that does happen. People burn out. People realize it's not for them. I mean, I think the PhD is not for everyone. And it really doesn't... a lot of great jobs are out there for people who don't get PhDs. And so... It's a massive undertaking for sure. And, a lot of kids, you go to college and you're in the top N% of your computer science class, and your professors are all telling you, hey, you should get a PhD because you're really good at this. But I don't think that's the right advice. I think, get a PhD if you want to be a researcher or if you want to teach and if you're passionate about those things. But if you're just, at the top of your field, that doesn't mean that you should do it. So I think, some students came in with that was the default next thing that they did. And sometimes that worked out and sometimes it didn't. But it's all about, the students who made it really wanted to be there, I think, and were productive as well. That's the magic combo.
Would you say that someone who is not in the top of the class during the masters could be a successful PhD candidate?
Oh yeah, of course. Well, and especially in my situation where we were all in a computer science department, but studying human-computer interaction primarily. I mean, we did do some computer science as well, but we tended to be on the human side of things. and more that side than the algorithmic side of things. And so it could very well be the case that someone would underperform in an algorithms class, which is a very different type of intelligence from being able to be a great, say, qualitative researcher for human-computer interaction. Yeah. But yeah, absolutely. I think there are so many different kinds of intelligence in the world, and I've seen some people just really succeed who just, at first you thought they have no chance, they're not going to make it. You know, maybe language barrier, or maybe they didn't seem to have the technical skills, or, you know, there are all these different stories where it's like, and then you see them 5 years later and they've just blossomed. And it's amazing to see. I've seen quite a few cases like that. And then you see the opposite too, of someone coming in and being like, wow, this person is so articulate and seems to be very technical and does everything right, but they just can't get that traction, or it's not a great fit for them, or whatever, and they end up sort of fading away. So,
would that be an argument that actually everyone should try to do a PhD because because you never can say in advance if it's the right thing or not?
I would say no. I mean, I think in the United States there are too many PhDs probably.
Okay.
So, though, you know, in a sense, there are more job opportunities now than there used to be because the big tech companies have started hiring PhDs more explicitly.
Yeah, right. So you are right now. What's the job title of you?
My job title is Senior Applied Scientist.
Okay. So are all your colleagues having PhDs? Like all people with such a title, do they have a PhD at Amazon?
In my group, yes. I think broadly across Amazon, it's not quite as consistent, but it's kind of supposed to be. It's evolving norms, and you know, Amazon is catching up, I think, to a large degree to other tech companies, but they're definitely making a huge investment in research, and in particular, all areas related to machine learning. And they have a couple of different research job titles. So there are applied scientists, there are also data scientists and research scientists, there are also economists. And so in my group, all of the research scientists and applied scientists do have PhDs. That's a requirement. And across Amazon, most employees with those job titles have PhDs or equivalent, you know, research papers, you know, a strong academic track record. Whereas data scientists typically do not have a PhD, but in some cases do.
Since we are talking about academia and industry, you know that there's some stereotypes, like people think typically maybe in industry it's always about money, and in the universities you have a lot of academic freedom, you're trying to do good to the world, maybe noble things. Is that true, the stereotype?
No, I don't think that is true. I mean, I think it's wrong on both sides, but there's maybe a seed of truth to it, right? I mean, ultimately, when you're working in industry, it is about the bottom line at some level, but different people contribute to that in vastly different ways. So not everyone is contributing to a profit center. I mean, you could work at Google on fairness, and that may not drive any profit at all. It might be quite the opposite. But it's something that Google has deemed important overall, and why they deem that important overall is because they're a profit-driven company, and they want to make sure that people trust them. Academia, I mean, yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of freedom there, and many people are working towards, you know, a better future for humanity in computer science. But a lot of people aren't, frankly. I mean, there is a lot of research that comes out that doesn't seem to have much to do with making the world a better place. Very incremental improvements. You know, publishing is, to a certain extent, can be gamed, and you know, everyone's trying to advance in their jobs, right? And to a certain extent, you're a slave to fundraising, because professors aren't paid well enough, and so and there's maybe no funding for PhD students, and so, you know, more and more. Well, and I'll say, like, National Science Foundation grants are extraordinarily competitive. You know, they fund at 5 to 10% acceptance rate, and So an alternative path that's become much more common are industrial grants, like from Amazon, which are wonderful for researchers. But those grants certainly encourage a certain type of commercial research, right? Research with commercial applications. For me, it's more about what is the individual researcher working on? What are the problems that they're focused on, and are they happy, and are they helping? What are they helping be better in the world? So.
When you were a PhD student or a postdoc at the university, were you subject to some clear KPIs that the university or your professor told you you must publish at least one top paper per year, or you must get research funding, otherwise you should maybe look for some other position?
No, thankfully no. We had yearly reviews, performance reviews, and that was a time to check in, because if a student wasn't being productive, they needed to know that. At our university, there wasn't a metric that we tracked.
Mm-hmm. So you work now since about 3 years for Amazon. If you compare the last years in academia as a postdoc or research scientist with your work at Amazon now, how does a typical day look now at Amazon for you, and how did it look like in academia?
COVID has changed everything, and so I'll try to separate out what's fundamentally different from what's different, mm-hmm. because everyone works in a different way than they did 3 years ago. In my role at the University of Minnesota, I spent a lot of time with students. Sometimes just talking with them, sometimes working on a paper together, sometimes just helping them with computer science homework or whatever. Like, there was just a lot of engagement with students, because I sat in a lab and students were always around me, and there's a certain energy to that that's really fun, and but that also, that takes a lot of your time. Mm-hmm. I taught as well, and so teaching, of course, takes a lot of time. So all that being said, it was a much more diverse job, because I was doing a lot of mentoring, a lot of academic teaching work, but then also I was trying to do research work of my own sort of founding. And I liked that. And so there was a lot more diversity. The other thing is that the academic world has a nice ebb and flow to it. So there's an academic calendar where things kind of slow down in the summer, and then they speed back up in the fall and the spring. So there were some times of year where it was just very relaxed and easy, and other times when it was frenetic. And so in industry, there's a lot less of that variation. My days are much more homogeneous. In the sense that I have a set of problems that I'm focused on, and I devote a lot of energy to solving those problems and working with other people to solve those problems. Instead of students, now I have software development engineers who I collaborate with, but as well a team of scientists. So it's just different. Yeah, so the flow of work is that's kind of the big thing that I've said. I mean, the nature of the work itself is obviously different as well. Though we do seek to publish, we also seek to influence our production systems through machine learning, applied machine learning work. And so there's a lot of work that we do that is not publishable. And that work is super fun too, and it can be very, very creative and hard work. Amazon, of course, this wouldn't be true across all companies, but we have so much data that it really, is a blessing and a curse that there's so much data to work with. And so we spend a lot of time trying to understand that data and to use it in ways that can positively impact our customers.
Which part of your life was the most stressful part? You mentioned already the first years doing your PhD were quite stressful. Was that the most stressful time in your academic and professional career?
That's a good question.
I guess business startup was probably stressful. Maybe
different sorts of stresses in different parts of life. Mm-hmm. But certainly, I remember the written preliminary exam, which was at the end of my first year of the PhD program. That was up there in terms of peak stress. because that was an exam that not everyone passed.
How about work-life balance? Like academia or industry, what is better maybe to build a family or to maintain friends or have some hobbies?
Yeah. Well, so definitely startup is not the way to go for work-life balance.
Yeah.
That would be my primary takeaway. And then the second thing would be, it really depends. You can't just say across the board that one is better or worse than the other, because it's very circumstantial, and it's also personality driven. Some people choose to work very long hours, and some people choose to not work very long hours. And so I've managed to find work-life balance because I have prioritized that for myself. I have 2 kids at home, and I love working, but I also love them, and I want both of those things to be what my life is about. And so I've managed to make it work well both at Amazon and at Minnesota.
If you think about career chances like nowadays and maybe 20 years ago, is it easier for people today or 20 years ago to have a successful academic career or to find a job in the industry?
That is a fascinating question. I don't feel like I'm qualified to answer that, honestly.
Okay.
I think that's a question you should ask Joe.
Okay.
I mean, it's interesting because so I do feel like academia is maybe harder.
Well, let me rephrase the question. If you think of yourself, how difficult or easy it was to get a PhD position and get some funding as a TA.
Right.
And then when you were researcher at the university and you supervised PhD students, so maybe 10 years later, the PhD students at that time, did they have it better or worse than you had it 10 years before that? Or similar?
Well, I mean, one thing is for sure, and that is that the expectation for publishing has grown over time. And it's a little unclear if that means that it's easier to publish now, or if it just means that the expectations are legitimately higher. I don't really know. But I know that, back in the 90s, it could be the case that you had one paper published and you could get a top faculty job. And these days, I believe top faculty jobs, they're going to people with many papers as lead author. And so that is certainly harder. I think we have it good these days with the job market. So if you're not seeking to go into academia, I think the job market is great for someone who knows about recommender systems and has a PhD or a master's degree for that matter. Tons and tons of opportunity.
You mentioned already you were lucky to have Joe Konstan as your PhD supervisor. Do you have any advice for prospective PhD students how they can get as lucky as you were to get a good PhD supervisor?
Well, what I've advised students that I've mentored over the last 10 years or so is to try to make sure that you do your homework before committing. So that, I didn't do any of this. So this is all advice that I developed after doing the thing. Make sure that you have calls after you get into programs, or even before applying. Reach out and try to get a sense for whether there's a fit there. And after you've been admitted, make sure you have phone calls and check your gut, which of your options feels like the one where you will have a productive relationship with that mentor. Because I think that there are lots of different ways of working in the world. And so for me, going back to group lens, so I feel very lucky that Joe Konstan was my advisor. He is a wonderful mentor, and I could go on about that for a long time. He's not for everyone. He is a very hands-off mentor. And some students really benefit from a very hands-on mentor. And that was John. So Joe and John were, the co-founders of the lab, and they worked incredibly differently. But they were both wonderful people and wonderful advisors. And so what worked for me wouldn't have worked for another person in the lab because they needed that daily intensive interaction. And for me, it was, the occasional check-in worked just fine. And I loved being self-directed and just getting the occasional burst of inspiration from having a meeting with Joe.
Did you send an email to Joe, or did you talk to him in person?
I think I sent him an email, and then we met and chatted, and he was curious what I thought about recommender systems. He was curious about my background, academic background. So he was vetting me to a certain extent because I was sort of an unknown PhD student at the time. And then, so we just decided to, do a little trial, and that ended up working out, I guess.
Did you have ever any role models as a PhD student where you said, okay, I really want to be like that person, or that person is really inspiring me, I want to be like that person?
Sure. The easy answer is Joe and John and Lauren. They were easy role models. But maybe to be a little bit more interesting in my response than that, I think that as a junior PhD student, certain senior PhD students were role models, as well as the research scientist. This is the job I later had, but at the time, it was held by a guy named Dan Frankowski, who now is one of my closest friends. So that's been a lifelong friendship. But he was certainly a role model. He'd been working in industry for a long time and really had a lot of work practices that I felt like I was learning a lot from working with him and observing how he solved problems. Dan Cosley was another PhD student at the time, and he was just a remarkable sort of thinker, and he was not influential in terms of how I went about my work, but in terms of how to communicate research ideas, how to be creative in the research space, and how to critique other people's ideas in a way that is highly useful, but not at all confrontational, or making sure you deliver the hard feedback that they need, but keeping it friendly and so forth. And so examples like that, I think my role models were very local and immediate. I didn't look so much to external role models. Randy Pausch was an example of someone who might have been an external role model, who was a famous Carnegie Mellon computer science professor. But because I didn't work with them or know them as much, they had less influence on me than the people I saw around the lab and worked with, I think.
Would you have any advice for prospective PhD students? Is it possible to plan a successful PhD career or an academic career? Did you plan your career way in advance, or did you rather always just made a decision when there had to be made a decision?
Yeah, I used more of the greedy algorithm. I was never much of a planner. I always have this discussion with my wife, I wish I'd just majored in computer science in college. It would have been so much easier. And she was like, you're doing fine. What are you complaining about? But I always just did what was interesting and what felt like the right thing to do was next, and not thinking working backwards from this idealized career goal, I should do these things. But certainly lots of people have success doing that as well. Yeah, it's hard to say. I think the more that you can figure out in advance the type of work that makes you happy, and then working backwards from that, I think that would be my main advice. And so, less about prestige or salary or, these other outcomes. What makes me happy when I'm working? Is it working with students? Is it heads down technical work? There are all these different things you can do with the set of skills that you have in a PhD program, and thinking about which of those things makes you happiest. Do you love writing papers? Do you hate writing papers? Do you love teaching? Do you hate teaching? Writing code? There are a lot of different things, and I think that there are careers that emphasize those different pieces, and that's what I've ended on is I know the types of activities that make me the happiest, and I'm going to just try to get those in my life as much as possible.
Have there been any decisions that you would regret in retrospective, or or also decisions at that time where other people said, oh, don't do that, but you did it, and nowadays you are happy that you did it?
I don't really have any regret about my career. If I wanted to have made more money, certainly there were, I could have made very different choices. But that hasn't been my priority. My priority has been kind of balance, like having lots of different parts of my life that work in harmony. And I think, the choices I've made have worked out the way they've worked out, and it's been okay. So, we're lucky to be working, to have the skills that we have. Like anyone who's reading your blog is, kind of lucky to be working in this field, because there are so many good jobs, and it is such an easy career path in general. I mean, you just have to have some perspective on, like, we are lucky to be living at this time with these set of skills. It is truly remarkable.
So you would organize the Recommender Systems Conference again? That was a good decision?
No, probably not. I would probably not do that. That I dramatically underestimated what would be involved with that, and with COVID, doubly so. So it's, I'm definitely going to scale back in the near term how much time I'm spending volunteering on academic conferences.
Okay, good. But I'm looking forward to the conference. It starts tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. So it's I am. One of the weird things about organizing a conference is that most of the people who do it have never done it before, and there are so many different jobs, and I don't know why it works that way. It's actually kind of bizarre that there's so much institutional knowledge that, like, you develop through the 3 years of planning the conference, and then you kind of chuck it out the window, except when the next year's chairs happen to email you and they're like, hey, do you have this thing? And you can pass it along. But and I think that's how it works for almost all of the conferences in our space. So it's kind of a weird setup, but it's certainly a huge learning, and happy to contribute back to a community that I think is a great community.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I don't have any more questions. Do you have any more final advice for PhD students or postdocs?
I don't have any final advice.
Okay.
Advice would be become a student volunteer at the research conferences you care about, because that is the best way to meet other people and have a great time and really get the most out of the conference experience.
Yeah, I think that's very good advice. Yes, thank you.
Cool.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
You are welcome.